Well, this is BBC News, and we are continuing to get reaction and responses and reflections from world leaders right around the world to the death of Pope Francis after the Vatican announced the news that he has died at the age of 88. I want to bring you now, via our senior royal correspondent, a quote from His Majesty the King. The message is this. My wife and I were most deeply saddened to learn of the death of Pope Francis. Our heavy hearts have been somewhat eased, however, to know that His Holiness was able to share an Easter greeting with the Church and the world he served with such devotion throughout his life and ministry. His Holiness will be remembered for his compassion, his concern for the unity of the Church, and for his tireless commitment to the common causes of all people of faith, and to those goodwill who work for the benefit of others. His belief that care for creation is an existential expression of faith in God resounded with so many people across the world. Through his work and care for both people and planet, he profoundly touched the lives of so many. The Queen and I remember with particular affection our meeting with His Holiness over the years, and we were greatly moved to have been able to visit him earlier in the month. We send our most heartfelt condolences and profound sympathy to the Church he served with such resolve, and to the countless people around the world who, inspired by his life, will be mourning the devastating loss of this faithful follower of Jesus Christ. So that statement just in the last few minutes from the King. I just want to return now to David Willey, with BBC's Vatican correspondent for 40 years, and we had a response there from the King echoing so many of the reflections and words by world leaders around the world.
Indeed, he was a figure who was admired and esteemed by many countries. Everybody he came into contact with felt they got some special strength from a visit to the Vatican, and I thought it was very interesting that at the last minute he has received two very important visitors at the Vatican. That's to say, the King and Queen during their recent state visit to Italy, and even Vice President Vance, who managed to squeeze in a quick greeting to the Pope, actually the very day before he died on Easter Sunday. Yesterday, before we heard early this morning about his death in the early hours of the morning. I think Pope Francis I shall remember most as a man who was prepared to break boundaries, but he realized that the Catholic Church was suffering, both from a split between those who wanted reforms to take place and those who thought that for a church which has been accustomed to speak in centuries rather than in 4-year terms, like politicians, international politicians, and secular leaders, in the space of only 10 years, he's managed to turn around, I think, quite a lot of doctrine in the church without actually making any world-shaking changes to Catholic doctrine. I thought one of his most significant statements was some years ago when he was embroiled in the question of the scandals involving church dignitaries and many bishops and cardinals. He simply said, listen, who am I to judge? He was not judgmental. He tried to mediate. He tried to bring the church into a more modern frame of mind, and indeed used modern technology for the first time. The church has now got a big website operating. It has adopted modern technology in the way it spreads the gospel message. The church survived the COVID period when the Vatican was virtually deserted, and many people here in Italy never even went to church because it was forbidden. The church services were stopped. I think the COVID epidemic worldwide caused immense damage to the church because many people who had been regular mass goers previously and Catholic countries perhaps failed to return to church in the numbers that we were accustomed to before. But certainly by going to the far ends of the earth to preach his gospel message, and by visiting members of his flock, even, for example, in Mongolia, where there is a Catholic priest is now the local church leader. He's been promoted to cardinal, and there is less than 1% of the population is Catholic. He thought there was a role for the Catholic Church to play worldwide. And I think we're going to see the implications of this in the upcoming conclave, which will elect a successor to Pope Francis. Another very interesting fact I think we're going to notice in the days to come is that the Pope simplified the ritual for a papal funeral. He didn't want the massive funeral of a prince of the church. He's already chosen where he wants to be buried, not inside the Vatican, but here in a Roman basilica, not far from here. And he really wants to show, I think, that the church can adapt to the modern world without becoming corrupted by the temptations of the modern world, and particularly the political temptations. He's known how to keep the church away from politics, but into morals, which of course is where it counts.
David Willey, thank you very much for your reflections, former BBC Vatican correspondent. Well, we are keeping across all the different developments and reaction around the world. Of course, this is being felt so keenly in the Vatican and in Italy. We've had some reaction out of Italy. There were due to be 4 scheduled matches in the top flight of Italian football, Serie A, today on Monday. They have now been postponed following the death of Pope Francis. Just want to bring in my colleague Rich Preston, who's with us and has been monitoring reaction from world leaders and others right around the world. Rich, you can bring us up to date.
Lewis, in the last few moments we've had reaction from Russia. President Putin expressing his condolences over the death of Pope Francis and hailing him as a defender of the highest values of humanism and justice. President Putin says, "I had the privilege of communicating with this outstanding man on many occasions, and I will forever retain the fondest memory of him." And of course, in 2016, Pope Francis met the Orthodox Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, famously kissed him in a sign of bridging divides between communities, even within the church. This message from President Putin adding to the messages we've seen from other world leaders. The White House, in the last half hour or so, posting on X, "Rest in peace," alongside photos of President Trump and the First Lady meeting the Pope, and also J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, who met the Pope within the last couple of days and who's currently on a trip to India, and earlier said, "My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him."
Rich, thank you for that. Let's speak now to Tina Beattie, Professor Emerita, Catholic Studies at the University of Roehampton. Thank you for coming on the programme. Just want to start with getting your immediate thoughts. This news just less than 2 hours old and is spreading around the world now, and people will be given their reactions and reflections, and I just want to start with yours.
There's great sadness, of course, but I don't think this is a shock. Neither is it a tragedy when a very sick 88-year-old finds the peace of death. As Catholics, I don't think we should treat this kind of death as a shock and a tragedy. I think rather we should be immensely grateful for the wonderful leadership we've had from Pope Francis since 2013, and pray for him to rest in peace and rise in glory, and also bear in mind that we're now entering a time of deep uncertainty in the Church. So also our prayers for what happens next. But personally, I think, if I'm honest, I feel a sense of relief, because we saw when Pope John Paul II died, the sort of grueling process of an increasingly incapacitated Pope dying very slowly, also interestingly at Easter. And it was obvious in the last few weeks that Pope Francis was very ill, he had a tremendous dedication to duty and to all the peoples of the world, and tried so heroically to continue to show that right up until the end. But he's now at peace, and I just feel immense gratitude for all that he gave to the church, and a sense of relief for him that peace has come.
And of course, he faced challenges, as all popes do, and failures. What do you make of his time? He became Pope in his 70s, back in 2013. How do you try and assess the successes and failures?
I think he was a breath of fresh air. We'd had 2 fairly authoritarian papacies, and it would be wrong to describe him as progressive or liberal. These are political labels that don't map neatly onto leaders of the Catholic Church, but he certainly brought about a more pastorally sensitive and compassionate ethos in the church. He put the environment at the very top of his concerns, along with refugees and people who are marginalised by the present world order. He was an outspoken critic of neoliberalism, of the impact of global economics on the world's poorest and most marginalised. And in all this, I think he opened the doors of compassion and tenderness and a certain kind of pragmatism about the struggles of people's everyday lives, as opposed to perhaps strict doctrinal adherence to some of the church's rules. All this, I think, were very welcome to many of us. As a woman, I wish he'd done more of substance for women in the church. He did his best to promote women to more visible positions of leadership. He gave some women votes at the recent synods held in the Vatican. All this is good, but there were no substantial changes that can't be undone by a more authoritarian successor. And I think that is a regret for women like me. He could be quite stubborn. He could be quite romantic about women. But, you know, today is a day, I think, for being thankful for his legacy. It's also interesting that in his vocal criticisms of the global world order, he met J.D. Vance yesterday in a private meeting, very brief. But in February, he wrote a letter to the American bishops pointing out the wrongness of mass deportations. He was a passionate campaigner for social justice, particularly on behalf of refugees. And it was an unusually political letter. Popes don't intervene in party politics or national politics, but it was clear that he had J.D. Vance in his sights when he clarified a church teaching known as Ordo Amoris, the order of love, which Vance had tried to argue was about looking after our family, our neighbours, our community, our nation. And in a way, the implication was if there's anything left, which there probably isn't, we might look further afield. And Pope Francis intervened on that. There was a little spat in social media between Rory Stewart and J.D. Vance over it. And without naming anyone, Pope Francis, in that letter to the American bishops, made very clear that the teaching known as Ordo Amoris is not about a hierarchy of love. It's about an inclusive love from which nobody is accepted and except left out. And he was very clear that this particularly referred to those who are marginalised, impoverished and exploited by the global economic order. So he was no friend of far-right politics. But yes, as I say, I just think that it's a time to be thankful for what he gave the church and to hope that his legacy continues. But, you know, the Catholic Church has a long and messy history. It survives crises, it survives good popes and bad popes, and whatever happens, it will trundle on through whoever the next pope is. But at a time of growing global crisis and security, environmental catastrophe, we really do need someone who will continue Pope Francis's vision, I think.
Tina Beattie, thank you very much for your thoughts and analysis. Thank you.